أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. My respected brothers and sisters, elders, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, on behalf of the Islamic Institute of Toronto, I'd like to echo the sentiments expressed by Brother Farhad and extend a most warm and cordial welcome to each and every one of you. It is indeed a pleasure to see so many of you from so many different backgrounds, and I think it is safe to say that when the IIT was conceived, one of the things that we talked about was the need to ensure that we have an organization that is inclusive, an organization that would welcome people from different ethnic backgrounds, people who had different linguistic and cultural capacity. Before I start, I want to also acknowledge the work that Dr. Abdullah Hakim has done for the Muslim community as a historian. I'm not a historian, I'm a geographer, so I don't deal in time, I deal in space. And we also have Imam Abdul Hai Patel with us, and Imam Abdul Hai Patel I consider to be one of the pioneers of the Caribbean Muslim community in Toronto, and I do remember in the mid-80s when I first arrived in Toronto, going to the University of Toronto and listening to him as one of the first khatib. So I want to acknowledge our dear brother and thank him for his contribution to this community. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to bless him and his family and give him the ability to serve this community. I want to say a couple of things before I start. The first one is that I will speak primarily about Guyana for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that I am initially from Guyana. I will make reference to Muslims in Trinidad and Muslims in Suriname, as well as Muslims in the Lesser Antilles and the smaller islands of the Caribbean. But the focus of my presentation will be talking about Muslims in Guyana and the journey of indentureship and some of the legacy that our forefathers have left with us. I want to also acknowledge before I begin the work of a number of historians who have done a fair bit of work in this area, and they are, and this list is not exhaustive, a brother by the name of Raymond Chicory, our own brother Ahmad Hamid, Brother Udin Ismail, Dr. Basti Umangru, Dr. Tota Mangar, Mrs. Geeta Bahadur. These are all people who are very prominent historians from Guyana in particular and have done a fair amount of work on trying to demystify the whole issue of indentureship and talking about Muslims in the Caribbean and in Guyana in particular. I also want to say, brothers and sisters, that while I'll be talking about Muslims, I think we need to understand, and in particular East Indian Muslims and African Muslims, Dr. Abdullah Hakim dealt extensively with the issue of the slave trade, and we know that a big part of that has been Muslims from Africa, black Muslims. And the struggle was real, and the struggle continued to this day. Despite the abolition of slavery, there are still elements of our society where some aspects of what was experienced during that era, still perhaps some of those legacy is still with us. I also want to say that while this is about Muslims, Muslims were not the only individuals who made a contribution to the development of Guyana. Hindus in particular is the majority religion between Islam and Hinduism, and they also made a significant contribution to the economic, social, and cultural development of Guyana. I also want to pay tribute to the other ethnic groups. Guyana, as you know, is not only East Indians and blacks, but they're also Chinese, Portuguese, the indigenous people, and also those individuals of mixed race. The Chinese in particular and the Portuguese to a lesser extent made a significant contribution to the business community in Guyana. Many of the Chinese, originally, some of them came to work on the plantations as indentured servants, but many of them ended up in different various businesses. My own grandfather-in-law is of Chinese origin, and he was an electrician on the sugar plantation in what's now known as Plantation Blairmont, and I'll talk a bit about his struggle as a Chinese immigrant in Guyana. I also want to pay tribute to the indigenous people of Guyana. Many of us going to school, we heard about the Wai-Wai, the Arawaks, and the Caribs, and the Makushi. These are individuals who were in Guyana, in the Caribbean, well before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And these individuals continue to struggle to this day in very adverse conditions. And we ask governments all over the Caribbean to turn their minds to what's happening with indigenous people and try and ensure that these people enjoy some of the same things that other individuals within the Caribbean and Guyana enjoy. I also want to say that I stand before you as son of an indentured servant. Many of you in this audience are people who are descendants of indentured servants. Many of you who are not from Guyana or the Caribbean, but from India and the Arab world and other parts of Southeast Asia and Africa. There is a real connection between the West Indies and Guyana and the Arab world and India in particular, and Afghanistan. And Sheikh Abdullah Hakim expounded on many of these issues last week. I'll touch on some of these issues as well. So it is indeed a global community. It was a global community then, and it continues to be a global community. Brothers and sisters, I also want to acknowledge the contribution made by our forefathers, not to the economic development of Guyana, but I think in many respects, being responsible for who we are today and who we are. This is a particularly difficult issue for me because as a Muslim growing up in Guyana, our faith was founded and I think in many respects strengthened by the foundation many of us received growing up in very, very small rural villages in different parts of the Caribbean. And that foundation, regardless of how weak we might believe it was, I think made us who we are today. And in that regard, I'd like also to pay tribute to our many forefathers. Many of them have passed away, of course. Some of them who are direct descendants are still with us today. I want to pay tribute to them. I want to acknowledge them. I want to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to bless them in this world and the hereafter, and also those of our foreparents who have passed away. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cause them to be amongst the righteous. Brothers and sisters, today we stand on the shoulders of many of these giants in our community. We may not consider them to be giants. Their faces may not be on placards around the Caribbean, but these are people who unassumingly and quietly shape the religion that we all have come to know and love, and in many respects their legacy lives on. If you look at the Canadian community today, the GTA in particular, you will find there's a tremendous amount of presence of Guyanese and Trinidadians and people from Barbados and Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean. And my brothers and sisters, this is not about nationality, this is not about ethnicity, this is not about one race being superior over another race. This is about acknowledging and understanding our history so we can appreciate who we are and move on from there. In the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are all equal. But unless we understand and appreciate our history, it is difficult for us to go on and leave a legacy for ourselves. I also want to mention, before I get into my presentation, I think it would be remiss if I don't mention the strength of our sisters. Many of the women who made that journey and who worked alongside men in the fields while protecting their religion and their dignity. It is sad that sometimes, despite their best efforts, they were subjected to various forms of sexual and physical abuse. Women who deny themselves many privileges so that their children may enjoy a better life. Many of those children and grandchildren are here today. Today, brothers and sisters, in the limited time I have, I'd like to get through this presentation, of course. But I think it is important for us to acknowledge and realize that we have a very, very rich legacy. We're losing that, that link between us and our forefathers. As Brother Farhad said, many of our forefathers are at that stage now where I know my own father, when I speak to him, his eyes light up every time you talk to him about what happened in Guyana. And his memory, if there's one thing that he knows a lot about, it is the history of the West Indies and slavery and indentureship and how much the Muslims endure at the hands of the plantocracy. But despite that, and this is, if there's one thing that I think we need to remember, despite that, what these individuals had going for them was Islam. What they cling on to, what they held on to was Islam. And nothing could have shaken that faith. We may have, from time to time, deviated from what some might consider to be the authentic Sunnah, but over and over again, we're going back to that foundation that was established by our foreparents in the Caribbean. I have to tell you that while I will not be focusing on Trinidad as much as I'd like to, I should mention to you that there was this Guyanese and Trinidadian fella who went into a supermarket. So the Guyanese, and those of you who are from Guyana would know this, the Guyanese went to the back of the store and took 2 bars of chocolate and put it in his pocket. And he said to the Trinidadian, you see, I'll leave this supermarket with these 2 bars of chocolate in my pocket, and I wouldn't pay for it. So the Trinidadian said, okay, come with me, I'll show you another trick. So the Trinidadian went over to the cashier and says, give me a chocolate bar. So the cashier gave him a chocolate bar. He ate it. He says, give me another chocolate bar. Give him another chocolate bar, and he ate it. The cashier says to the Trinidadian guy, where's the trick? He said, those 2 chocolate bars I ate, check the Guyanese pocket. So, brothers and sisters, let's get going if I can get this thing to work. So first of all, I just want to recap on what we did last week. Guyana was colonized, as many of you know, by the English, Dutch, and the French. And this is evident if you look at the villages and the name of the villages across Guyana, you will see that history. Names like Chateau Margaux, which is a French name, Blankenburg, which is Dutch, Liverpool and Amsterdam, which are all English names. You will see that this history of colonization is reflected in the names of the villages along the coast of Guyana. It is estimated that the English, French, and Dutch transported more than 4.6 million slaves to their colonies in the Caribbean between 1651 and 1830. The date of the arrival of the first African slave in Guyana is not known, but it is estimated to be as early as the mid-17th century. The planters, when the slaves arrived on the Caribbean, the planters adopted what was called the divide and rule principle, in that they try as best as they can to separate families, to prevent many of the slaves from practicing their religion. And there were also many Christian missionaries who were there to try and obviously influence the Muslims and primarily the Muslims to practice other religion. There were also, and this was inherent in the attempt by the plantocracy again to try and divide the slaves. There was a caste system among many of the slaves between what was called the drivers or the overseers, the artisan slaves, the factory slaves, and the field slaves. And there was also division based on color. Obviously, the darker skinned slaves were seen as inferior, And as time progresses, there were some intermarriages, and it was discovered that the slaves of lighter skins were obviously sometimes seen as enjoying greater benefit. If you look at indentureship versus slavery, we will find that there wasn't a lot of difference between slavery and indentureship. Many would consider indentureship as a new system of slavery. I've quoted a number of individuals, for example, the Chief Justice in the 19th century, who says that it is a rotten, monstrous system rooted in slavery. And here he was talking about indentureship. On the recruitment process, and again, we went through this last week, indentureship, there were a number of what we call push factors that prompted the migration of individuals from India to the West Indies. Unemployment in those days were very high. There was also chronic poverty. There's a lot of indebtedness. And in those days, when you're indebted to an individual, you were indebted in many cases for life. And that caused some of the individuals who left India to come to the West Indies to be seen as escaping that indebtedness. There were also a number of outcasts or Dalits, people, and especially some of the women who came on the ships from India to the West Indies were people who were considered to be outcasts, and we'll get into a bit more details on what this is later on. Many of them were also the people who did the recruitment, used very deceitful tactic to recruit Indians from India to the West Indies. They promised them lucrative employment and enriched opportunities. In many instances, there were labor laws, but these labor laws were heavily rooted in favor of the plantation owners. This is in the backdrop there is a statue of coffee. Many of you would probably recognize that. And we heard from Sheikh Abdullah Hakim that Muslims' arrival in Guyana can be traced back to slavery. And when the Muslims from Africa went to the Caribbean and in Guyana in particular. In 1763, a rebellion in Guyana was led by Coffee, and it is stated that the communication that Coffee wrote to the Dutch masters in that time was written in Arabic, and some would argue that Coffee and those around him were Muslims. I don't have any way to substantiate this except to say that Coffee sounds to me like Kofi, which is a Muslim name. So one would have thought that Coffee could have been a Muslim. The point I'm trying to make on this slide is that it wasn't just Southeast Asians or the East Indians from Guyana, from India that went to the West Indies that brought Islam to the Caribbean. In fact, Islam was brought to the Caribbean and in Guyana and the West Indies by the beginning with the slave trade. Now, where did Muslims come from? Most of the Muslims in the Caribbean and the West Indies came from Northeast Asia, Uttar Pradesh, Lucknow, Agra. Agra is where the Taj Mahal is. Faizabad, and the name and pronunciation of some of these places have changed over the years. Hyderabad, the northwest frontier, and there are also many Muslims who migrated from India to the West Indies who came from Afghanistan, and we'll talk a bit about some of those Muslims later on in the presentation. If you look at that, that's a map of India, and most of the Muslims came from the northeast part of India, and most of them boarded a ship from a port of Calcutta. So when you look at some of the landing papers for Muslims in the Caribbean and in Guyana, in particular in Trinidad, you will see that the origin, in many cases, is listed as Calcutta in those days, Kolkata now, but that's the ship and the port from which they left India to come to the West Indies and Guyana. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they were actually from Calcutta itself. This is a newer map of India, and the intention here again is to show you where the Muslims came from. This is a copy of the landing documents for a woman who migrated from India to Guyana. And if you look carefully, you will see the place where that individual came from. Here it says Faizabad. It also tells you which plantation that they're destined to. In this case, it's Anna Regina. We may have some brothers and sisters from Anna Regina here. You'll also notice at the bottom of the landing paper, it had something called distinguishing features. So this would be in this one, it says scar on left knee. So you can see that the indentured servants were also examined pretty detailed to make sure that they were in good physical condition. And this is an indication of a distinguishing feature that was discovered in the case of this sister. The name also has the father's name, the age, the caste, which is important. And if you look at the next, in this document here, you see caste listed as Musalman. Musalman obviously is Muslim. So many of the Muslims, their caste was listed as Musalman. And you would also notice that this brother, this is a landing document for a man. He was destined for plantation Blairmont. Blairmont is where I am from, and where many people want to be from. This is the landing documents for the individuals who traveled from India to the West Indies. It's also interesting, and I didn't manage to get a picture of it, but at the bottom of the landing document, it is also signed by someone who claimed to be the protector of immigrants. And it's funny that the British, in this instance, gave these individuals very seemingly authentic names, but in practice, many of these individuals did not actually perform the role they were supposed to perform. So they were supposed to be a protector of immigrants on these landing documents, but this individual obviously did not do a good job at protecting the people that in most cases it was he who he was responsible for. Now these are the two ships, the Whitby and Hesperus, that sailed from Calcutta to the West Indies and Guyana. So this is a picture of the first two ships that set sail. Port Georgetown, for those of you who don't know Guyana, Georgetown is the capital of Guyana. And the other interesting thing I found doing this research is that there is a region or a village in northeast India, not far from where many of the East Indians came from, also named Georgetown. So it might be purely coincidence, unless that name in India came from the British long ago, and then that name was duplicated in Guyana. But these are the two ships, the Whitby and the Hesperus, that made sail from India to the West Indies. Now, if you look at these in those days, the journey itself was up to 90 days. So think about individuals, our foreparents, traveling in these ships for more than 3 months, crossing the Atlantic Ocean to get to the Caribbean and in Guyana in search of what they considered to be a better life. I shared this document before. I want to talk a bit about religious tolerance before I go on to the other aspect of the presentation. And I want to do this because I think it is only fair that as Muslims, we acknowledge the contribution made by other communities. And I did say at the onset that there was a tremendous contribution also made by the Hindu community in Guyana. It's also interesting to note that there was also a significant amount of harmony between the Muslim community and the Hindu community. And I think this is perhaps partially attributable to the journey they made together. One of the questions in the questionnaire spoke about what is jihadis. Jihadis are people who made the journey together from India to the West Indies. When I read about jihadis, I thought about what the Indian subcontinent people refer to as hajibais. So these are people who travel together, endure all of the pain and suffering for over 3 months, crossing the oceans to get to Guyana. So I think that resulted in a significant bond and a relationship between the Hindu community and the Muslim community. And in fact, I remember when we were building and doing renovation to the local mosque, none of us knew how to write Arabic. We knew how to read Arabic, of course, but we didn't know how to write Arabic. And we got one of the young people who knew calligraphy from the Hindu community to come and write the Arabic for us in the masjid. So there was a relationship between the Muslim community and the Hindu community, but at the same time, I think there were clearly limits defined by each community and clearly boundaries that I think were not crossed. And as I said, that tolerance and understanding and relationship was perhaps forged by the treacherous journey that they made together from Calcutta and different ports from India to the Caribbean. Now, this is a map of, it says a map of Guyana, but it's actually a map of the West Indies. It's not a map of Guyana. There is Trinidad. I just wanted to provide this by way of context. And the next is a map of Guyana. Now, just by way of introduction to the non-Guyanese in the audience, they said there are two types of people in this world, right? Guyanese and those who want to be Guyanese. So this is a map of Guyana. This is the Guyana coat of arms. This is the Guyana flag, of course. This is Kanji pheasant, which is a national bird. This is the cheetah, which is a national animal, I think. Now, most of the people in Guyana live along the coast, which is a couple hundred miles long and a few miles wide. Most of the population live along the coast. For those of you who don't know Guyana, again, Guyana is divided into 3 counties, Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo. The capital of Georgetown is in Demerara. This is Berbice. Demerara is this portion here, and Essequibo is the rest of the country. A few significant facts about Guyana. Guyana has one of the largest falls in the world, Kaieteur Falls, which has a single drop of 741 feet, which is actually higher than Niagara Falls. The Rupununi Savanna, which is in this area here, and the Amazon rainforest are real treasures. And in fact, for those of you who are interested as part of the whole climate change agenda, Guyana was actually paid hundreds of millions of dollars by the European Union and Norway in particular to keep the forest protected. So as a contribution to Guyana's contribution to the environment, the European governments, a number of them, paid Guyana to keep that forest in its pristine state. Now let's move very quickly. We're running out of time. Indentureship was a global phenomena. Of course, Mauritius was one of the first colonies to receive indentured labor. And then in the West Indies, we had Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, Grenada, and a number of other Caribbean countries. Now, indentureship in Guyana, initially, they were considered as what's called Gladstone Coolie. Coolies, as you know, is a derogatory term, but it is how, even on to today, people refer to Guyanese and of East Indian origin as coolie. Now, Gladstone was one of the plantation owners, and Gladstone rode to the colonial empire seeking permission to get indentured servants to work on the plantation in Guyana. Because the Indians were accustomed to working in places like Mauritius, they thought that they would be more suitable to work on the sugar plantations in Guyana, and this was the origin of indentureship in Guyana. Gladstone, who was, as I said, the owner of the plantation in West Demerara, Vredenhoop and Vredenstein. And just to pause for a moment, Vredenhoop and Vredenstein, again, these are Dutch names that symbolizes the colonization by Dutch. Vredenhoop means peace and hope, and Vredenstein means peace and stone. Gladstone, who was a plantation owner, obtained permission from the East India Company, and the East Indian Company was commissioned to be the transporter of slaves from India to the West Indies, and that was the beginning of the indentured servants from India to Guyana. The initial batch arrived in Guyana aboard the Whitby, which you saw earlier, and the other ship Hesperus in 1838, in May of 1838. And the difference between the slaves and indentured servants is that the slaves were bound for life on the plantation. The one difference is that the indentured servants signed a 5-year contract, and after the 5-year contract, they theoretically were supposed to give them a piece of land, or if they chose, they could have returned to their homeland. Many of them did return to their homeland, and as many of you know, many of them stayed, and as a result, some of us are here today. The system continued uninterrupted, with the exception of between 1839 and 1845. The system occurred between 1838 and 1917, and during this period about 250,000 immigrants came to Guyana, and a total about 500,000 came to the Caribbean. And of the ones who came to Guyana, the 240,000, 75,000 returned to India. So a majority of them stayed back in Guyana. This is my great-grandfather, and as you can see from the dress, many of you probably come from the South Asian subcontinent would realize the dress. One of the things that my dad told me about the early Muslims is that they paid a lot of attention to their salah, to the recitation of Quran, and also to the practice of cleanliness. And this may surprise many of us, but there are lots of stories to demonstrate that these were individuals who had Iman in their heart and were very keen on practicing their Islam. This is a copy of the registration book that was made every time a ship entered the Caribbean, Guyana, Trinidad. Record was made of all of the immigrants, and there are reams and reams of books like this in the archives in Guyana and in Britain. And we don't have time to go through all of them, but yeah. I have 5 more minutes, so I have to go through this very quickly. I want to speak very quickly about the journey over the Kalapani, and those of you who know Hindi will know that the Kalapani is the Black River, and that's how the indentured servants refer to the journey across the ocean. And again, you might see some elements here that reminds you of the ships that transported African slaves to the Caribbean. Overcrowding, inadequate food, lack of fresh water, a number of waterborne diseases occurred on the ship as well. Life on the plantation was very difficult. Here again, you can see a number of quotes. For example, one plantation owner said, you know, give me my heart's desire in coolies, and I will make you 1,000,000 hogsheads of sugar. One hogshead, as many of us know, is 54 imperial gallons. So the main objective of the plantation owners was to try and exploit the Indians and do the best they can to try and ensure that they maximize their input. Many of the indentured servants couldn't leave the plantation. If they left the plantation, they had to get what's considered to be a pass, and that pass was in itself a very humiliating experience for them. This slide also shows that in 1863, of the 5,000 prisoners in Georgetown, over 3,000 were indentured laborers. This doesn't mean that these were individuals who were bad or criminal in nature. It just spoke to how dilapidated and skewed the penal penal code was, and the system was against the indentured servants. I want to go through this very quickly. This is a picture that shows a typical plantation owner's house, as opposed to the lodges that the indentured servants lived and occupy. This is a photograph of a sugar plantation, a sugar factory. If you look carefully, you'll probably see the trench where the cane will come. There is also a scale that weighs the cane as it comes into the sugar factory, and it's dumped, and the process of manufacturing of sugar begins there. I want to spend a bit talking about the masjids that were built by the slaves. And the first masjid that was built by the slave was in 1780 in a place called Queenstown. This is not Queenstown Masjid in Georgetown, but it's Queenstown on the Essequibo Coast. This was built in 1780. Many of the Muslims who built this masjid were slaves. Again, Sheikh Abdullah Hakim spoke to the origin of many of these slaves. The term fulaman that we are all accustomed to, Muslims were referred to as fulaman, again because of the religion and tribe which date back to the days of slavery. The other masjids that were built later on were masjids in Philadelphia and Jackalow. The Philadelphia masjid was built in 1865 by an individual called Maulvi Chan Khan. The Jackalow masjid was built in 1912 by a brother by the name of Muhammad Safarfraz. He and his wife Ghafuran came from India to Guyana. They settled in Berbice and later on spent time in Demerara and Essequibo after they were relieved of their indentureship. Again, the masjids were basic facilities. In this case, it was 12 feet by 15 feet. It was thatch roofed, and it was mud walls. And in those days, the masjids were very rudimentary and very basic. There were also a number of very highly educated East Indians who made the trip. Among them, there were two Hufaz in Clonbrook. Both of them last name were Khans. And the important thing that I referred to earlier is that many Muslims very early set up masjids. And there is a masjid in every single village in Guyana, and attached to the masjids are madrasas or maktab. In 1949, there were 6 Guyanese who made the Hajj. And the issue about modesty is also important. I've read instances where there were many Muslim women who were in positions of leadership or who were fairly wealthy in those days, and they would provide instructions to their workers observing a purdah or a barrier between them and the workers. We don't have time to go through the festivals that were celebrated in Guyana. I want to talk a bit about some of the struggles that the Guyanese people, East Indians in particular, felt during the period of indentureship. Among the first East Indians to rebel were 2 Muslims, Jumun and Pultun, and both of these occurred on Gladstone Estates in Reed and Hoop. There were also an issue with the plantation gang in Lenora, and I can talk a bit about this later on in the Q&A. We also had disturbance at Plantation Hague in 1870, in Plantation Devonshire Castle in 1872. In this particular case, in 1872 in Devonshire Castle on the Essequibo Coast, 5 laborers were killed. They were actually shot by the police, and several others were wounded. There were also the issues with resistance on plantation Rose Hall, and many laborers also lost their lives during that. I'm not going to go through this, but in Lenora in 1864, many of us heard about the struggle of a woman named Kausila, who was also known as Alice. In fact, Kausila, her body was severed in 2 when it was driven over by a tractor. Again, this is an indication of women being at the forefront of the struggle. And if you look at the second picture, that's also a photograph of the other women who were part of that resistance in Lenora in 1864. So, and finally, before I conclude, I want to talk a bit about one individual who has some connection in Toronto, and that is an individual by the name of Gul Muhammad Khan. And Gul Muhammad Khan very quickly has a connection to the Islamic, the Muslim Welfare Center and Major Abbas. So Gul Muhammad Khan was an individual who came from Afghanistan, from the Patan region, left Afghanistan to go to India to get his brother to come back with him because his mother was ill. However, Gul Muhammad Khan decided to stay in India and spent 2 years in India and boarded a ship from India to Guyana. He landed in Guyana in 1867 on a ship called King Arthur, and he joined the police force. It's actually a funny story how he joined the police force. I didn't get into to this in my earlier presentation, but when the coolies or when the East Indians arrived on the sugar plantation, they were inspected by the plantation owners. And when the plantation owner was going through the line to inspect the East Indians who had arrived, Gul Muhammad Khan saluted the plantation owner. And the plantation owner wanted to know why is he saluting him, but they couldn't communicate because obviously they did not speak the same language. But as a result of that, instead of assigning Gul Muhammad Khan to a plantation, he actually asked him to join the police force. So Gul Muhammad Khan was relieved of his indentureship as a plantation worker and went to join the police force. He married a sister named Musammat Rahima Khan, and they had 11 children. Now, Gul Muhammad Khan, after his indentureship, went back with 9 of his children to India. Now, one of the children, her name is Gulshanara Khan. And Gulshanara Khan's daughter is Sarwar Jahan, and Sarwar Jahan was Major Abbas's wife. So Major Abbas' grandfather-in-law lived in Guyana. And the other important thing about Gul Muhammad Khan is that he was the first imam for the Queenstown Masjid in Georgetown, Guyana. And if you look at the petition that Gul Muhammad Khan made in the late 1800s to the colonial power, seeking permission to get a masjid constructed, it's amazing. It is something that I think many of us today would have written to our political establishment. He talked about the need to retain the Muslim cultural identity. He talked about the need to ensure that children are educated and remain in Islam. It was a well-articulated, well-written petition. So Muslim Welfare Center and the Afghan population in Canada and in Toronto has also a relationship to Muslims in Guyana. I'm not going to go through this, but this is simply some of the milestones in Guyana. Guyana obtained independence in 1966, and this is actually a funny story. In that very year, England won the World Cup. And there is a story that says that the British were so overjoyed by winning the World Cup of cricket, they could care less about whether or not Guyana received independence, so they acquiesced. In closing, brothers and sisters, I know we don't have much time, but hopefully we can get into dialogue. The intention here was to try and stimulate the discussion rather than sort of give you a lecture. I want to again pay tribute to our forefathers, the inspiration that they provided to us, the grit and determination, the religion and culture that they passed on to us that allow many of us to be where we are today. And again, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless them. They're the ones who spearheaded the struggle, and the one individual that I think I would be remiss if I don't mention, and there are many organizations, as you know, in Guyana, including the CIOG, the Guyana Islamic Trust, the Guyana United Sadar Islamic Anjuman, and there were a couple of organizations, one formed in 1934 and one formed in 1936 under British Guyana. There are many organizations that actually led the revitalization and the continuation of Islam. But there's also a significant event that happened in Guyana in the mid to late 70s, and that was with the arrival of the charge d'affaires from Libya, Dr. Ahmed Hawass, and there is a poster outside with him. And he brought, in a lot of people's mind, somewhat of an Islamic renaissance in Guyana by rekindling that Islamic spirit. And as a result of the training and education that he inculcated and promoted, Islam is alive and well. But again, what he did and that spark that he rekindled was there all along by Muslims and organizations that were there well before him. I want to mention also, brothers and sisters, and this would be the slide that I close with, and this is what Sheikh Abdul Hakim also closed with last time. The legacy continues, and if you look at this picture, many of these mosques and the contribution of Caribbean Muslims to many of these mosques is very, very prevalent. Again, this is not an issue about identifying any particular race or ethnicity, but to share in the rich history that we have as people from the Caribbean and from the West Indies. Often when you think about the West Indies, you don't think about Guyana because Guyana is on the mainland in South America, but in fact Guyana has more in common with the West Indies and the Caribbean than it does with South America. Guyana is the only English-speaking country in South America, of course. So linguistically and culturally, we have a lot more common with the West Indies and with the Caribbean than South America. So I'll close there, and I would really like to get into a bit of a back and forth. If you have any questions or you have any concerns, anything you want, or any story that you want to relate to, that would be most welcome. So thank you very much. Jazakumullah khair.